Kamala Harris or Donald Trump? For many Latin American political leaders and residents, this will be one of the most important questions to be answered in the coming days as the US goes to the polls on November 5. But while the outcome could well have significant impacts on the agendas of governments around the region, Latin America is unlikely to be among Washington's top priorities in the coming years, regardless of who wins. In that regard, the Brazilian Report spoke with Peter Hakim, President Emeritus of the Inter-American Dialogue, a Washington-based think tank focused on the affairs of the Western Hemisphere, to gain some insight into the impacts that the US elections might have on Latin America. This podcast features the highlights of that very conversation, which was also transformed into an article published on our website. My name is Lucas Berti, Latin America reporter at the Brazilian Report, and this is Explaining Brazil.
If you like Explaining Brazil, you should subscribe to our website, The Brazilian Report, which is the journalistic engine behind this podcast. Or you can go the extra mile and make a donation to our newsroom, tipping our journalists via our Buy Me a Coffee page. And you can also subscribe to our Buy Me a Coffee fan page, pledging a monthly contribution to our newsroom in exchange for exclusive content that you won't find anywhere else. Our Buy Me a Coffee subscribers are Andrei Novoseltsev, Wild Rice, Jaciara de Oliveira, Carson Allen, Gabriel Luca, Pan Ludwig, Leslie Seal, Mark Hillary, Louise Renz, Erwan Menais, Aaron Berger, Kars Vrieswick, Alistair Townsend, Miller Renacido, Peter Abramson, David Dixon, Jose Ozi Stankovic, Emerging Market Muser, Anna Lund, Peter Suffren, Anderson da Silva, and someone who chose to remain anonymous. And our Buy Me a Coffee members come from all over the world, so please, if we're butchering the pronunciation of your name, please send us an email. If you too believe in the importance of independent journalism, and if you want to hear your name on our podcast, go to buymeacoffee.com/Brazilian Report and subscribe to one of our membership levels. Click on buymeacoffee.com/Brazilian Report to find out more.
When it comes to the possible impacts of this year's US elections on Latin America, Mr. Hakim is quick to clarify. The region isn't a priority for Kamala Harris or Trump. Whoever wins, he believes, will make Latin America a low priority, as the country's sights are set on the other parts of the world, with only a few issues being potential exceptions. And this is where we began our interview. From a Latin American perspective, we are very much interested in what is happening in the US, depending on which of the candidates will win, Donald Trump or Kamala Harris. What we can expect in terms of issues such as migration, the relationship between the US and in Cuba and Venezuela, and also in the support for weak democracies such as Guatemala, and which are the fundamental differences between the approach under Kamala Harris and under Donald Trump.
Let me just start out by saying, which I've been saying now for quite a long time, that I don't think that the U.S. has sort of any special interest in Latin America. In other words, that's not what's worrying the United States very much. It's not sort of challenging the United States a whole lot. The United States doesn't have the resources or the business interest in Latin America that it may have had at one time or another, and was preparing to somehow develop a region-wide free trade agreement. In other words, the U.S. is, and I see it backing off year by year, even when you take something like the Bolsonaro-Trump connection. I've gone through a lot of the material that and it's very hard to find any kind of agreement that really sort of was meant to benefit each of the countries, to last over time. At one point, they signed what they called a tiny or small, what did they call it? A small trade agreement, a mini trade agreement. That's exactly what it was. And all that, when I read it, all it said was that they were going to continue talking about this. They were going to continue negotiating. So I'm not very, sort of feeling that the U.S. is really looking for. So what happens is then the main issues that the U.S. has with Latin America are issues where Latin America is annoying, bothering, creating difficulties for the United States. The question is, what can we do about migration? Migration is a problem. We just, it's sort of, no one wants to see it. So let's look at this from the standpoint of the two, if you like. One, migration is just overwhelming. I think that Kamala Harris, at least, was ready to have this document passed that, in fact, they worked through with the Republicans. And that's particularly her position, that we'll try to keep the numbers as low as possible. If they were a little bit sharper, they would say, well, let's divide up this group of people. There are people that can make enormous contributions here. I think Kamala is pretty easy. I mean, I think she's going to pursue more or less the same line as Biden, and softly and not very aggressively in any of these issues, particularly as far as I can see. With Trump, there's two things that are very interesting. One is this transactional, that he wants something in return. The second is he's now sort of struggling. The only thing that interests him today is, how can I get more votes to win tomorrow? I mean, there's nothing else on his agenda but winning this election. I think that if anybody, and so he is very narrowly focused on making certain efforts. He may not make the right ones, but his notion now is, how do you get people to go out and vote? How do you get them to go out and vote for me? How do you get them to see Kamala as being incompetent? This is his task now.
A lot of people wonder what will be of the relationship between, in case Donald Trump returns, with a lot of big players in Latin America.
Well, that's very interesting because, number one, I think that it sounds to me like Boric has a very kind of ideological view of the world. He's moved more to the center, but he really wants to do things right. He sort of has this, he comes out early, sort of criticizing the United States and their role in the Gaza war. And he says it very deeply, and it takes Petro and Lula a little bit longer to say anything. But in other words, he's just a very straightforward. I don't think he can have an easy relationship at all with Trump. I mean, Trump doesn't, sort of see the differences. I mean, let's do what I have to do to get what I want.
Recently, we had some spats between high Venezuelan officials and the Lula government. There are even some officials in Venezuela who accused Lula of being controlled by the CIA. and this classic narrative that we know of the Maduro administration. So now we can see that, and also Boric, which is part of this so-called new left, it's criticizing Maduro, it's criticizing what happens in Nicaragua also. So do you think that this if we think of Brazil, Colombia, and Chile, if we it is possible to see that it is important to these governments to pressure Venezuela in a way to get closer of the U.S., get closer to what the U.S. thinks regarding the Venezuelan politics today?
I think that actually the U.S. is closer to the Brazilian Petro at this moment for a couple of reasons that are sort of have not gotten as much attention. They've gotten some attention. One is the U.S. doesn't want to create any problems in the petroleum market. They don't want to see the cost of petroleum go high. That means keeping Venezuelan oil in the market, which means reducing some of the sanctions. And I don't think the U.S. wants to take that back. And, that's very big. The other is that I think that the U.S., I may be wrong, understands that with Brazil and Colombia, two countries that are on the border of Venezuela, that they really, if the U.S. can keep Brazil and Petro from making a deal that somehow suggests that they don't care about the results of the election, that the U.S. doesn't want that to happen. So the U.S. has to continue to, right now it'd be very difficult for Brazil to say, okay, Venezuela, this is part of the narrative, let's keep it going. Maduro has to sort of take risks now. And I think that be surprised. I just don't see the U.S. wanting to. And the third issue, I forgot this completely. You don't want another outflow. You don't want another expulsion or outflow of people from Venezuela. That the sort of Colombia, Chile, Brazil, all want the Venezuelans to stay in Venezuela. And certainly the U.S. wants them to stay in Venezuela. So yeah. I think that the U.S. and Brazil has made one very important statement that I think has gotten maybe critical for the whole process with Venezuela. That is to prevent Venezuela from being part of the BRICS.
Okay.
They are the only country that's been excluded from the BRICS that I know of, at least. I mean, maybe I'm wrong, but it just seems to me that that's a strong penalty. It's not a easy penalty.
When we think of the relationship, the ideological relationship between Jair Bolsonaro and Donald Trump, we can't escape of doing a comparison when it comes of a possible scenario in which we have Javier Milei in Argentina right. and Donald Trump in Washington. So in case Trump wins, do you think Javier Milei will have a greater impact in terms of this political propaganda for the right?
I don't know. There's. Let me just tell you that there's nobody else in Latin America now that is quite like Milei. I mean, and he's a little bit nuts, but he sort of is trying to prove a point. If he's successful, the U.S. Trump U.S. might sort of reach out to him and bring him in and bring him. But it's hard for me to imagine Argentina really being able to provide anything for the U.S.
It's interesting because there's a lot of possible scenarios. There's also one in which we have Mexico, both Mexico and the U.S. Ruled by a woman. We can have Kamala Harris and Claudia Sheinbaum at the same time, ruling in the two of the biggest countries in all the Americas. So
we really have to wait on Mexico, though, because no one can tell us yet who is going to be running Mexico. Is it
okay?
Is it AMLO or is it Sheinbaum?
So you think that AMLO can maybe be a ruler by proxy?
Well, it's not only by proxy. I mean, he's got a political party. That's the biggest political party. It has a majority in Congress. For her to get things through Congress, presumably, unless she can sort of push him out, then, or maybe they'll find a way to work together. So, I mean, it's just, predicting the future is hard.
So, Mr. Hakim, we need to talk about the Amazon and the climate change and the environmental discussions that are happening now in South America. Because Petro, we had recently the COP16 in Colombia, and we also have when Lula returned for his third term, he promised to center environmental discussions in Brazil again because he accused Bolsonaro of being an environmental denialist. Right. So do you think that the U.S. will be part of these discussions? Because we saw a difference. We saw a shift when we had Joe Biden coming in 2021 in comparison with Trump. But do you think that in the coming years, regardless of the winner in the U.S., we will see the green agenda being at the center of discussions, or do you think it will be another thing that won't be a priority to the U.S.?
As far as I can see, there's opportunities, and if Brazil and the U.S. really sort of join together and recognize two things. One is that there's a lot of money needs to go into the Amazon, more than the U.S. or Brazil is either able or willing to put to the task. In other words, that it's going to be expensive for the next 10, 15, 20 years to sort of do something. And secondly, the extent to which I've heard several debates between U.S. actors and Brazilian. And what's clear is there's also beyond the Amazon, which everyone sees as trees and water and grass land, there's 30 million people living there. And those 30 million people are Brazilians. And so the question is the U.S. going to be able to sort of work with 30 million Brazilians? And does this bother at all the Brazilians that the U.S. will somehow sort of have a more privileges within than it might other? But I think that the U.S. and Brazil, if they sat down and said, look, we got to raise $10 billion. Where do we go? How do we do it? How do we get the French and the Norwegians and the Russians, the Chinese maybe. But in other words, how do you begin to save the Amazon? And does Brazil want them to ask that question? And I'm not sure Brazil does.
That was Peter Hakim's take on the possible impact of the U.S. election in Latin America. Mr. Hakim is President Emeritus of the Inter-American Dialogue. Thank you for listening, and be sure to keep an eye on the Brazilian Report's coverage of the US election.
If you like Explaining Brazil, please give us a 5-star rating wherever you get your podcasts. Or better yet, subscribe to the Brazilian Report, the journalistic engine behind this podcast. We have a subscription-based business model, and your memberships fuel our journalism and keep us going and growing. And our work has been recognised for its quality. We've won several international awards. In April 2024, the Brazilian Report was named the best news website in the Americas for a small or local newsroom by the World Association of News Publishers, WANIFRA, and more recently, the Brazilian Report won the best story at the 2024 Digiday Media Awards for our story on the hacking attempt of one of Brazil's Supreme Court justices. And to continue doing this work, we need your support, so go to Brazilian.report. Thanks for listening, and Explaining Brazil will be back next week.